John's hands trembled, not from the December cold seeping through the storage facility's concrete walls, but from the weight of what lay scattered before him on the dusty floor. 3 years of invisibility on Portland's streets had taught him that survival meant minding your own business, keeping your head down, and never asking questions that might draw attention. Yet here he knelt, surrounded by evidence that could unravel everything he thought he knew about the Morrison family's disappearance. The bundles of cash felt real enough, crisp hundreds bound with bank straps, each marked with dates from 2.5 years ago. He counted quickly, his accountant's muscle memory kicking in despite the tremor in his fingers. Conservative estimate, over $2 million. But it was the manila folder marked insurance policy that made his stomach clench with recognition. Inside, photocopied bank statements revealed a web of shell companies funneling money through offshore accounts. Transaction codes he'd seen before, back when he still wore tailored suits and commanded respect in federal courtrooms. Back when Linda still answered his calls and his daughter didn't cross the street to avoid him. The numbers told a story of systematic embezzlement, but the dollar amounts suggested something far beyond corporate fraud. A photograph slipped from between the pages, Senator William Carver shaking hands with a man John didn't recognize outside what appeared to be a private jet. Someone had written Phoenix meeting, March 15th in careful handwriting across the back. John's breath caught. Carver chaired the Senate Banking Committee, and March 15th would have been just 2 weeks before the Morrisons vanished. The storage unit's fluorescent bulb flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows across family photos that now seemed sinister in their ordinariness. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings, soccer games and school plays, all staged performances by people who weren't who they claimed to be. Even the children's artwork taped to the filing cabinets felt like props in an elaborate deception. John heard footsteps outside and quickly shoved the documents back into the folder. Through the unit's metal door, he glimpsed other auction winners loading their prizes into pickup trucks and U-Hauls. Normal people buying normal things, furniture, old electronics, forgotten heirlooms. None of them had stumbled onto evidence of federal crimes. None of them were holding proof that might explain why a family of 4 had simply evaporated from existence. His phone buzzed. Dead battery warning at 12%. The homeless shelter closed check-in at 9 p.m. and it was already past 7. He should pack everything up, lock the unit, and pretend he'd bought nothing more dangerous than Christmas decorations. Walk away like he'd walked away from everything else that mattered in his life. Instead, John found himself pulling out a small laptop computer he'd missed during his initial search. The screen flickered to life when he opened it, displaying a password prompt. Sarah Morrison's laptop, probably. The missing daughter whose smile haunted the FBI's wanted posters around the city. He tried the obvious combinations. Birthdays, pet names, addresses. Nothing worked. But then he noticed something scratched lightly into the laptop's palm rest. Numbers that looked random unless you understood financial coding systems. Unless you'd spent 20 years tracking money through digital mazes before throwing it all away at casino blackjack tables. The laptop unlocked on his 3rd attempt. The desktop contained dozens of encrypted files with names like Insurance Final and Phoenix Evidence. But it was the single unencrypted document labeled Read First, John that made his blood turn to ice water. If you're reading this, we're probably dead. My name is David Morrison, not my real name, but it's the only identity my family has known for 3 years. We were placed in witness protection after discovering that certain members of Congress have been using federal disaster relief funds to finance private military operations overseas. Senator Carver is just the visible piece. The real conspiracy involves 9 senators, 4 congressmen, and at least 2 federal judges. They found us despite new identities, new location, new lives. If something happens to us, the evidence is all here. Bank records, recorded conversations, photographs, financial transactions, everything needed to prove treason at the highest levels of government. We trusted the wrong people in law enforcement. Some of them are compromised, too. I don't know who you are, but if you've found this, you have a choice. You can walk away and stay safe, or you can finish what we started. But understand, these people will kill anyone who threatens them. They killed us. They'll kill you too. The encryption key for the evidence files is Sarah's birthday backwards, plus the year we entered witness protection, 08241. Good luck. You're going to need it. David Morrison. John stared at the screen until the words blurred. Outside, car doors slammed as the last auction winners drove away into the night. The storage facility grew quiet except for the rain's relentless drumming and the distant hum of Portland traffic. He was alone with secrets worth killing for, holding evidence that could topple the federal government or get him murdered in some dark alley. Just him, a broken man who'd lost everything that mattered, faced with someone else's impossible burden. The laptop screen dimmed automatically, reflecting his weathered face back at him like a ghost. The ordinary world. John closed the laptop with shaking hands and shoved it deep into his weathered duffel bag. The weight of David Morrison's words pressed against his chest like a stone, but survival instincts honed by 3 years on the streets kicked in. Move, keep moving, questions and conspiracies were luxuries he couldn't afford, not when the shelter beds were filling up and December rain was turning to sleet. He locked the storage unit and walked 6 blocks through Portland's industrial district, his boots splashing through puddles that reflected neon signs from late-night diners and 24-hour laundromats. The familiar rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other helped quiet the chaos in his mind. This was his routine, his ordinary world. Survival measured in 12-hour increments, each day a small victory against invisibility and despair. The Burnside shelter occupied a converted warehouse that smelled of disinfectant and unwashed humanity. John arrived at 8:47 p.m., 13 minutes before cutoff, and took his place in line behind faces he'd known for months. There was Martinez, the former construction worker whose back injury had cost him everything. Sarah, not the missing Morrison daughter, but a 23-year-old aging out of foster care with needle tracks on her arms and defiance in her eyes. Old Pete, who'd been living rough so long he'd forgotten his real last name. "Johnny!" Pete's voice carried the rasp of too many cigarettes and Portland winters. "Heard you won something at that auction today. Finally gonna buy yourself some decent shoes?" John glanced down at his worn boots, held together with duct tape and stubbornness. Just some old Christmas decorations. Nothing special. The lie came easily. 3 years of homelessness had taught him that information was currency, and sharing it made you vulnerable. Even here, among people who understood what it meant to lose everything, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The laptop in his bag seemed to burn against his back, but he kept his expression neutral. Inside the shelter, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while caseworkers checked names off clipboards. John had earned a semi-permanent spot through months of following rules and avoiding trouble. Bed 47, 3rd row from the back, positioned strategically near the emergency exit. Old habits from his accounting days: always know where the exits are, always have an escape plan. He set his duffel bag in the narrow space between his cot and Martinez's. The construction worker was reading a week-old newspaper, squinting in the harsh light. "Says here they're still looking for that family," Martinez said, pointing to a small article buried on page 6. "The Morrisons. 3 years and the FBI's got nothing. Makes you wonder what really happened to them." John's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "People disappear all the time in this city. Most of them don't want to be found." "Yeah, but a whole family? 2 little girls?" Martinez shook his head. "That's different. That's someone covering their tracks." Around them, the nightly ritual of the displaced played out in whispered conversations and careful positioning of meager belongings. Young Sarah was arguing with a caseworker about her missed appointments at the methadone clinic. Old Pete was organizing his collection of bottle caps with the precision of a museum curator, each person carrying their own weight of loss, their own reasons for ending up in this fluorescent-lit purgatory. John lay on his thin mattress and stared at the water-stained ceiling. 6 months ago, this routine had felt like rock bottom. A former CPA with a corner office reduced to competing for shelter beds and free meals. But routine brought comfort. Even here, predictability meant safety. No one expected anything from him, no one counted on him, and most importantly, no one was looking for him. The Morrison evidence changed everything. David Morrison's final message echoed in his memory: "You can walk away and stay safe, or you can finish what we started." But what did John Hartwell have left to lose? His professional reputation was destroyed. His family had written him off, and his savings had vanished into casino counting rooms years ago. Yet, lying here, surrounded by Portland's forgotten people, he realized he did have something to lose. This small community of survivors, this fragile network of people who watched each other's backs and shared their last cigarettes. Martinez, who saved newspaper articles about missing families because he still believed someone should care. Sarah, who fought her addiction one day at a time while the system tried to grind her down. Old Pete, who'd appointed himself unofficial keeper of shelter folklore and terrible jokes. They weren't much, but they were his people now, his ordinary world. And if he started asking questions about federal conspiracies and murdered witnesses, he'd be putting them all at risk. The lights dimmed at 10 p.m., but sleep wouldn't come. John listened to the symphony of snores and restless shifting, acutely aware of the laptop containing evidence of treason just inches from his head. Tomorrow would bring the same routine: breakfast at the mission, job hunting at the library, another night hoping for a shelter bed. Except now, ordinary felt like a lie he was telling himself. John woke at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of someone screaming his name. Not John Hartwell, the name he'd been using at the shelter for 3 years. Someone was shouting Johnny Morrison in the pre-dawn darkness, their voice cutting through the usual symphony of snores and restless shifting. His eyes snapped open, adrenaline flooding his system as he processed what he'd heard. Nobody knew that name. Nobody should know that name. He lay perfectly still, listening to Martinez's steady breathing beside him and old Pete's familiar wheeze 2 beds over. The shelter's night security guard was making his rounds, flashlight beams sweeping across the rows of sleeping bodies. Everything appeared normal, but John's forensic accountant training had taught him to trust patterns, and this felt wrong. Had he dreamed it? 3 years of street life and the stress of yesterday's discovery could be playing tricks on his mind. But the fear crawling up his spine felt real enough, and the laptop hidden in his duffel bag seemed to pulse with dangerous energy. At 6 a.m., the shelter's fluorescent lights flickered on, signaling the start of another day. John went through the motions of his morning routine, folding his thin blanket, storing his belongings, shuffling toward the bathroom with 40 other men who smelled of rain and desperation. But his eyes kept scanning faces, looking for anything out of place. The breakfast line at St. Andre's Mission moved with familiar efficiency. Oatmeal, coffee that tasted like burnt water, day-old bread donated by local bakeries. John took his usual seat near the back exit, positioning himself where he could watch both entrances while appearing to read Martinez's discarded newspaper. "You look like hell," Sarah said, sliding onto the bench across from him. Not Morrison's daughter Sarah, but the young woman from the shelter whose arms bore the roadmap of her addiction. Worse than usual, I mean. Couldn't sleep. John forced himself to take a bite of oatmeal. Bed springs. She studied his face with the sharp intelligence of someone who'd learned to read people for survival. Bed springs don't make you check every door in the room. What's got you spooked? Before he could answer, a man in an expensive suit walked through the mission's front entrance. He looked wrong here among Portland's homeless. Too clean, too well-fed, too purposeful. John watched him approach the volunteer coordinator, show some kind of identification, and begin what appeared to be an earnest conversation about missing persons. The man's eyes swept the dining room methodically, professionally. When his gaze lingered on John's table, every instinct screamed danger. "I need to use the bathroom," John muttered, standing abruptly. "Johnny!" He was already moving, heading for the rear exit with measured steps that wouldn't draw attention. Behind him, he heard Sarah's confused voice, but he couldn't risk looking back. The suit was still talking to the coordinator, but John caught the moment when the man's posture changed, when his casual scan became focused attention. The back alley behind St. Andre's smelled of garbage and broken dreams. John emerged into grey December light, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. His duffel bag felt impossibly heavy, the laptop inside it like a ticking bomb that threatened to explode his carefully constructed invisibility. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number that made his blood freeze. "Mr. Morrison left you quite a puzzle. We should talk. Pioneer Courthouse Square, noon. Come alone or your friends at the shelter start having accidents." The message deleted itself as he watched. John's hands shook as he stared at the blank screen. Somehow, impossibly, they'd found him. The same people who'd made a family of 4 vanish without a trace had tracked down a homeless accountant in less than 20 to 4 hours. David Morrison's warning echoed in his memory. These people will kill anyone who threatens them. But it was the threat to his shelter friends that cut deepest. Martinez with his bad back and dog-eared newspapers, Sarah fighting her demons one day at a time, old Pete, who'd never hurt anyone in his 70-odd years. They were innocents who'd stumbled into his ordinary world, and now that world was collapsing because he'd opened a laptop he should have left encrypted. Another text arrived, this one containing a photograph that made his stomach lurch. Martinez walking out of the shelter this morning, a red circle digitally drawn around his face like a target. The image quality suggested professional surveillance equipment. John leaned against the mission's brick wall, overwhelmed by the impossible choice David Morrison had left him. Walk away and let innocent people die for his cowardice, or step forward into a conspiracy that would almost certainly cost him his life. The December rain began again, Portland's eternal benediction over its forgotten citizens. John pulled his hood up and started walking toward the river, acutely aware that his 3 years of invisible survival had just ended. The ordinary world was gone. Only the abyss remained. John walked the waterfront for 2 hours, the Morrison laptop weighing heavier with each step. The Willamette River stretched before him like molten steel under Portland's perpetual grey sky, its surface disturbed only by the occasional tugboat pushing barges toward the Columbia. He'd walked this same route hundreds of times over 3 years, finding comfort in its predictable rhythms. Now every face in the crowd seemed potentially hostile, every parked car a possible surveillance post. The smart play was obvious. Drop the laptop in the river and disappear into the network of homeless camps that sprawled beneath Portland's bridges. He could catch a freight train south, start over in Sacramento or Los Angeles with nothing but his survival skills and the clothes on his back. He'd done it before, reinvented himself after the gambling addiction destroyed his accounting practice, after his wife filed for divorce, after his daughter stopped returning his calls. But the photograph of Martinez haunted him, the red circle drawn around his weathered face like a sniper's crosshairs. These weren't people who made idle threats. They'd eliminated an entire family, including 2 children, to protect their conspiracy. What would they do to a former construction worker whose only crime was sharing newspaper articles with a homeless accountant? John found himself at Tom McCall Waterfront Park, sitting on the same bench where he'd spent countless afternoons, watching tourists and joggers navigate their ordinary lives. A young mother pushed a stroller past him, her daughter's laughter carried away by the wind. Normal people living normal lives, blissfully unaware that senators were committing treason and families were being murdered to cover it up. His phone showed 10:23 a.m., less than 2 hours until the meeting at Pioneer Courthouse Square, 2 hours to decide whether John Hartwell would fade back into invisibility or step forward into David Morrison's nightmare. The rational choice was clear. He was 58 years old, broken by addiction and failure, with no resources except a sharp mind dulled by 3 years of mere survival. What could he possibly accomplish against a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government? He wasn't a hero. He was a man who'd lost everything because he couldn't walk away from a blackjack table. But that same compulsive personality that had destroyed his life was now fixated on the Morrison files. The accountant in him wanted to trace every transaction, follow every thread until the pattern revealed itself completely. The financial records he'd glimpsed suggested a money laundering operation that dwarfed anything he'd investigated during his professional career. Federal disaster relief funds, money meant for hurricane victims and flood survivors, being funneled through shell corporations to finance private military contractors. The scope was staggering. Not just corruption, but systematic theft from the most vulnerable Americans while people died waiting for aid that would never come. The Morrison family had died trying to expose this, and their evidence was now John's burden to carry. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. 3 names: Martinez, Sarah, and Old Pete, the closest thing to family he had left. He could warn them, tell them to leave Portland immediately. But people like them didn't have options. No cars, no money, no places to go where federal conspiracies couldn't reach them. A memory surfaced unbidden: his daughter Emma's 8th grade graduation, the last family event before gambling consumed his life entirely. She'd won an award for a social studies project about government accountability, her young voice confident as she read from prepared remarks about citizens' responsibility to speak truth to power. He'd been so proud that day, certain his daughter would grow up to change the world. Emma was 26 now, a lawyer in Seattle who'd inherited his analytical mind but none of his weaknesses. She hadn't spoken to him in 4 years, but he could imagine her voice if she knew about the Morrison evidence. "Do the right thing, Dad. For once in your life, do the right thing." The laptop contained recorded conversations, bank records that could be verified independently, photographic evidence of secret meetings, everything needed to prove treason at the highest levels, if he could get it to the right people without being killed first. But David Morrison had trusted law enforcement and died for it. Some of them are compromised too, his message had warned. John stood up from the bench, decision crystallizing with painful clarity. He couldn't run, not when innocent people would die because of his cowardice. He couldn't fight, not directly against an organization with unlimited resources and government connections. But he was still an accountant, trained to find patterns in chaos and follow money through its darkest hiding places. Maybe that was enough. Maybe a broken man could find redemption by finishing someone else's unfinished mission, even if it cost him his life. The December rain began again as John walked toward Pioneer Courthouse Square, carrying evidence that could topple the government or get him murdered. Behind him, the Willamette River flowed toward the Columbia, indifferent to human conspiracies and the ordinary courage of desperate men. Pioneer Courthouse Square stretched before John like an arena, its red brick expanse dotted with early lunch crowds and holiday shoppers. He arrived 20 minutes early, positioning himself near the Max Light Rail entrance where he could monitor the surrounding streets. The Morrison laptop felt like a lead weight in his duffel bag, its encrypted secrets burning against his spine. Crossing the square felt like walking through quicksand. Each step carried him further from the invisible safety of street life into a world where powerful people murdered families to protect their crimes. There would be no going back after this meeting. He understood that with the clarity of an accountant balancing a final ledger. Win or lose, John Hartwell's 3 years of anonymous survival were over. A businessman in a charcoal coat emerged from Starbucks at 11:58, scanning the crowd with professional efficiency. Mid-40s, athletic build, the kind of confident bearing that suggested military training. He made eye contact with John and nodded toward the courthouse steps. "Mr. Hartwell," the man's voice carried a slight southern accent, cultured but with steel underneath. "Thank you for coming. I'm Agent Collins, though that's not the name on my current identification." "Federal agent?" "Was. Now I work for people who prefer to remain nameless." Collins settled beside him on the courthouse steps, maintaining the casual posture of old friends meeting for coffee. "You've stumbled into something significant, Mr. Hartwell. David Morrison was a very thorough man." John kept his hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Thorough enough to get his family killed." "Yes, unfortunately. The people we're dealing with don't believe in half measures." Collins pulled out his phone, showed John a live video feed of Sarah walking toward the methadone clinic. A red laser dot danced across her chest. Neither do we. The casual cruelty of it, using a recovering addict as leverage, crystallized something cold and furious in John's chest. These weren't patriots protecting national security. They were predators who'd convinced themselves that murder was just another business expense. What do you want? The laptop, obviously. Morrison's evidence, his contacts, anything else he might have hidden in that storage unit. Collins smiled without warmth. In exchange, your friends continue breathing and you disappear permanently. New identity, fresh start somewhere warm. Consider it a generous severance package. John watched tourists taking photos near the bronze sculptures, their ordinary concerns suddenly precious and distant. Martinez would be at the library now, methodically searching job listings he'd never qualify for. Old Pete was probably organizing his bottle cap collection, preparing stories for tonight's shelter audience. Simple lives that mattered precisely because they were simple. I need to see the files first, John said. Verify what Morrison actually found. I'm afraid that's not possible. Then you get nothing. The words surprised John with their firmness. I was a forensic accountant for 23 years before gambling destroyed my life. I know the difference between evidence and fabrication. If Morrison died for this information, I need to understand what it contains. Collins studied him with the calculating gaze of a predator reassessing his prey. You're not in a position to negotiate, Mr. Hartwell. Your homeless friends make excellent leverage precisely because nobody important cares if they live or die. Except me. John stood up, decision crystallizing with terrifying clarity. And I'm the only person who knows where Morrison hid his real insurance policy. It was a desperate bluff. He'd found no evidence of additional hidden materials, but Collins's micro-expression suggested it had landed. The agent's confident smile flickered for just an instant, revealing uncertainty underneath. You have 6 hours, Collins said finally. Review Morrison's files, satisfy your accountant's curiosity, but understand that every minute you delay increases the danger to innocent people. We'll be watching. John walked away from Pioneer Courthouse Square feeling like he'd just signed his own death warrant. The city around him looked the same. Grey December light, persistent drizzle, the eternal rhythm of Portland life continuing unchanged. But he was no longer part of that ordinary world. He'd crossed an invisible threshold into a realm where senators committed treason and homeless veterans became acceptable casualties. His phone buzzed with a text containing an address in southeast Portland and a simple message, 1 hour. Come alone. The weight of the laptop seemed lighter now, its burden shared with whatever ghosts David Morrison had left behind. John caught the eastbound Max train, watching his reflection in rain-streaked windows. The broken man staring back still looked like a failure, still carried the hollow-eyed exhaustion of 3 years on the streets. But something had changed in the depths of those eyes, a flicker of purpose that gambling addiction hadn't quite extinguished. Behind him, Pioneer Courthouse Square receded into the grey December afternoon. Ahead lay the Morrison family's final secrets, and whatever truth had been worth dying for. John Hartwell was no longer running from his past. He was walking directly into the abyss, carrying the last hope of a murdered family and the fragile lives of the only friends he had left. The threshold was crossed. There could be no turning back. The southeast Portland address led John to an industrial district where legitimate businesses gave way to vacant lots and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. The Max train had deposited him 6 blocks away, forcing him to walk through a maze of auto repair shops and defunct warehouses while rain drummed against his hood. Every shadow could conceal a sniper, every parked car a surveillance team. The building matched the others on the street. Weathered brick facade, windows painted black, steel door marked only with faded numbers. John approached cautiously, hyper-aware that he was walking into what could easily be an execution. His phone showed exactly 1 hour since Collins's text. Whatever waited inside, punctuality seemed important to people who murdered families. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman in her 30s with prematurely grey hair and the hollow-eyed intensity of someone running on caffeine and desperation. She wore jeans and a Portland State University sweatshirt, looking more like a graduate student than a federal conspirator. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Rebecca Chen. David Morrison was my partner." The admission hit John like a physical blow. Morrison had mentioned partners in his recorded message, but John hadn't imagined they were still alive, still operating in Portland's shadows. Chen stepped aside, revealing a cramped office space filled with computer monitors, surveillance equipment, and enough financial documents to wallpaper a mansion. "Partner in what, exactly?" John asked, setting his duffel bag down carefully. "Originally, Treasury Department, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. We were investigating unusual patterns in federal disaster relief disbursements when we stumbled into something much larger." Chen locked the door behind him, engaged 3 separate deadbolts. "David thought you might be dead by now. Your friend Collins seemed confident he could arrange that." Chen froze, her face draining of color. "Collins is here? In Portland?" "Pioneer Courthouse Square 2 hours ago. He made very convincing threats involving my friends at the shelter." John studied her reaction, noting genuine fear beneath the professional composure. "I'm guessing he doesn't work for your team." "Jesus Christ." Chen moved to a bank of monitors, fingers flying across keyboards. "Collins is cleanup crew, the people who make problems disappear permanently. If he's here, it means they've decided to end this investigation." The screens filled with surveillance footage from around the city. John recognized Pioneer Courthouse Square, the St. Andre's Mission, even the storage unit facility where this nightmare had begun. Chen's operation was more sophisticated than he'd imagined, suggesting resources and expertise that challenged Collins's casual confidence. "How long have you been watching me?" "Since you bought the Morrison storage unit. We've been monitoring all their known assets, hoping someone would eventually access David's insurance policy." Chen pulled up financial records on the main screen. "What you found was just the beginning, Mr. Hartwell. David hid the real evidence somewhere only you could find it." John's bluff at Pioneer Courthouse Square suddenly felt less desperate. He mentioned something about my specific background. Forensic accounting. The money trail is embedded in plain sight, hidden within legitimate financial documents using techniques only someone with your expertise would recognize. David was brilliant that way, paranoid enough to trust the dead man's switch to someone who'd actually understand what they were looking at. Chen opened Morrison's laptop, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. The screen filled with what appeared to be routine federal budget allocations. Disaster relief funds distributed after Hurricane Marcus devastated the Gulf Coast 18 months ago. To a casual observer, the numbers looked appropriately bureaucratic and boring. But John's trained eye immediately spotted the anomalies. Routing numbers that didn't match regional banks, recipient organizations with suspiciously similar corporate structures, payment schedules that defied standard government procurement procedures. "Shell companies," he murmured, leaning closer. "Dozens of them, all funneling money through the same offshore accounts. $3 billion in hurricane relief funds," Chen confirmed, "stolen while people died in FEMA trailers waiting for aid that never came. The money financed private military contractors operating in Syria, Sudan, Myanmar, anywhere American interests needed plausible deniability." The scope overwhelmed John's comprehension, not just corruption, but systematic theft from disaster victims to fund shadow wars that Congress had never authorized. American citizens left to die so senators could play geopolitical chess with blood money. "Senator Richardson was the primary architect," Chen continued, "but the conspiracy reaches into justice, treasury, even parts of the intelligence community. David tried to work within the system, bring evidence to the FBI. That's how they found him." John studied the financial documents, his accountant's mind automatically tracing money flows and corporate relationships. The pattern was elegant in its complexity, a web of legitimate businesses and government contracts hiding systematic looting that dwarfed anything in American history. You need someone to testify about the financial evidence, he realized. Someone with credentials to explain the money laundering to a jury. Chen nodded grimly. David's recordings prove the conspiracy exists, but financial crimes require expert witness testimony. Someone who can walk prosecutors through how $3 billion vanished into offshore accounts while hurricane victims died waiting for help. Outside, footsteps echoed in the alley, multiple sets, moving with military precision toward the building. Chen's fingers flew across the keyboard, killing monitors and activating what looked like an emergency protocol. The footsteps outside had stopped, a tactical pause that suggested professionals taking positions rather than casual passers-by. "How many exits?" John whispered, his accountant's mind automatically cataloguing escape routes like balance sheet entries. "2. But they'll have both covered." Chen pulled a pistol from her desk drawer, checking the magazine with practiced efficiency. Collins doesn't leave variables in his equations. John had never held a gun, never imagined himself in a scenario where violence was currency. 3 years on Portland's streets had taught him to diffuse confrontations through submission and invisibility, not resistance. Yet here he was, crouched behind surveillance equipment, while federal conspirators prepared to murder him for possessing evidence of their crimes. "The financial records," he said suddenly. Morrison embedded additional evidence in the routine transactions, didn't he? Patterns that would only be visible to someone analyzing the complete data set. Chen paused her defensive preparations. "David said you'd see it eventually. The shell companies aren't just money laundering, they're a communication network. Each transaction contains metadata, coded messages between conspirators, account numbers that correspond to operation codes, transfer amounts that represent body counts from Black Ops missions." The revelation staggered John. Not merely theft, but a complete shadow government conducting unreported wars, while systematically looting disaster relief funds. Every hurricane, every flood, every American tragedy had become a funding opportunity for operations that violated international law. A soft sound came from the front door, metal against metal, the whisper of lockpicks working against Chen's deadbolts. Professional entry techniques that suggested Collins had brought specialists. "There's a basement," Chen whispered, leading John toward a concealed floor panel. "Connects to the storm drain system. You can reach the Willamette from there. What about you?" "I'm not running anymore." Chen's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been hunted too long. "David died believing someone would finish what we started. That's you now, whether you want it or not." John gripped the Morrison laptop tighter, understanding that he was about to become the sole keeper of evidence that could topple the government or justify his murder. Chen was preparing to sacrifice herself so a homeless gambling addict could carry David Morrison's truth into an indifferent world. The first deadbolt clicked open upstairs. "The metadata patterns," John pressed. "How do I decode them?" "Your daughter Emma works for Perkins Coie in Seattle," Chen said, pulling up information that made John's blood freeze. "Corporate law, government contracts division. She has security clearance that would let her access federal procurement databases. You've been investigating my family." David was thorough. He knew you'd need help from someone with both legal expertise and federal access. Chen handed him a encrypted thumb drive. "Emma's clean. We verified that months ago, but she has the resources to properly document everything you've found." The second deadbolt gave way. Footsteps on the stairs now, multiple teams converging with military precision. John stared at the thumb drive, understanding that Chen was asking him to drag his estranged daughter into a conspiracy that had already murdered an entire family. "I haven't spoken to Emma in 4 years. She won't even take my calls." "She will when you explain what's at stake." Chen activated the floor panel, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. $3 billion stolen from disaster victims, Mr. Hartwell. Shadow wars funded with American blood money. Your daughter became a lawyer to fight exactly this kind of corruption. John pocketed the thumb drive, his hands trembling with more than fear. The thought of contacting Emma, of admitting his failures while simultaneously exposing her to mortal danger, seemed like another kind of betrayal. But the financial evidence demanded expert legal analysis, and Chen was right about Emma's expertise in government contracts. The third deadbolt clicked. Chen raised her pistol toward the stairwell, her face composed with the serenity of someone who'd already accepted death. "Tell her about the Morrison twins," Chen said quietly. "Tell her that 8-year-old girls died because senators needed blood money for unauthorized wars. If that doesn't motivate her, nothing will." John descended into the storm drain as the first shots echoed from above, sharp cracks of professional gunfire answered by Chen's desperate return volleys. The darkness swallowed him completely, leaving only the sound of rushing water and his own ragged breathing. Behind him, Rebecca Chen was dying to protect evidence that could restore his purpose or destroy his life. Ahead lay the Willamette River, the city beyond, and an impossible choice. Contact the daughter who'd written him off years ago, or let a murdered family's truth die with him in Portland's shadows. The weight of $3 billion stolen dollars pressed against his spine as John crawled through the storm drain, carrying the Morrison family's final hope toward whatever redemption awaited in the December darkness. #Chapter 8. The ordeal begins. The storm drain stretched endlessly through Portland's underground arteries, a concrete throat that swallowed John's ragged breathing and Chen's dying gunfire above. Water rushed around his knees, carrying debris and the metallic taste of fear that coated his mouth like copper pennies. Each forward crawl brought him deeper into the city's bowels, further from Rebecca Chen's sacrifice and closer to a decision that would destroy what remained of his relationship with Emma forever. The laptop bag cut into his shoulder with every movement, its weight multiplied by the magnitude of what it contained. $3 billion in stolen disaster relief funds, shadow wars financed with blood money while hurricane victims died in FEMA trailers. The Morrison twins, 8-year-old girls, whose Christmas morning would never come because senators needed untraceable funding for operations that violated every principle of American democracy. John's phone buzzed against his chest, the screen casting eerie blue light against the tunnel walls. Collins. The display showed 17 missed calls in the past hour, each one a digital reminder that nowhere in Portland was safe anymore. They would be tracking him through cell towers, facial recognition cameras, every electronic footprint that modern life demanded. The homeless man's greatest asset, his invisibility, had been stripped away the moment he'd opened that storage unit. The tunnel branched ahead, offering 3 directions into Portland's underground maze. Left toward the industrial district where Chen's blood was probably seeping through warehouse floorboards. Right toward downtown where Collins's cleanup crew would be expanding their search perimeter. Straight ahead into uncertainty, following water that eventually reached the Willamette River and the bridges that connected Portland's east and west sides. John chose uncertainty. It felt appropriate for a man whose entire existence had become an exercise in impossible choices. The December cold bit through his wet clothes, stealing body heat with methodical efficiency. 3 years of street survival had taught him to recognize hypothermia's early stages, the uncontrollable shivering that was already beginning, the mental fog that made simple decisions feel overwhelming. He needed shelter, warm clothes, medical attention. What he had instead was evidence of government conspiracy and a daughter who'd stopped believing in him long before his gambling addiction had destroyed their family. Emma Hartwell Martinez. The hyphenated name still felt like accusation, as if she'd needed to distance herself from his failures through marriage to someone more stable. A corporate lawyer with government security clearance, according to Chen's research. Someone who'd built her career on the institutional integrity that John was now prepared to expose as elaborate theater masking systematic corruption. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber where multiple storm drains converged. Graffiti covered the concrete walls, territorial markers left by urban explorers and homeless camps that had been cleared by city sweeps. John recognized some of the symbols from his years on the streets, an underground language of survival that federal agents would never understand. These tunnels had sheltered Portland's invisible population for decades, providing refuge from both weather and unwanted attention. His phone buzzed again. Not Collins this time, a number he didn't recognize, probably another government operative trying a different approach. They would escalate soon, transition from surveillance to active hunting. Chen had bought him time with her life, but that credit was rapidly depleting with each passing hour. John pulled out the encrypted thumb drive Chen had given him, its black plastic surface warm from his body heat. Such a small object to contain evidence that could topple governments. Morrison had been brilliant in his paranoia, embedding financial communications within routine transaction data that only a forensic accountant would recognize as significant. But brilliance hadn't saved Morrison's family, just as Chen's sacrifice wouldn't guarantee John's survival. The water was rising. Somewhere above, Portland's December rain was overwhelming storm drains throughout the city, sending runoff cascading through the tunnel system. John could hear it rushing through distant pipes, a sound like whispered warnings that time was running out in multiple ways simultaneously. He thought about Martinez at the library, methodically searching job listings with the determined optimism of someone who still believed the system rewarded honest effort. About old Pete organizing his bottle caps, finding meaning in simple order while chaos consumed the world above. About all the invisible people who populated Portland's margins, surviving through strategies that required no conspiracy theories or government corruption. Just the daily courage to continue existing when society had written them off as acceptable losses. Collins had been right about one thing. Nobody important cared if homeless people lived or died. That indifference had been John's protection for 3 years, allowing him to disappear into Portland's street population, while his gambling debts and professional failures became distant history. But indifference was a double-edged sanctuary. The same invisibility that protected him meant his death would generate no investigation, no media attention, no consequences for the people who ordered it. Unless he chose to become visible again. Unless he risked everything on the possibility that Emma still retained enough of the idealistic young woman who'd once wanted to change the world through legal advocacy. The storm drain narrowed ahead, forcing John to crawl on hands and knees through rising water that carried the accumulated runoff of an entire city. Behind him, Chen's sacrifice was becoming meaningless with each passing moment. Ahead lay the greatest challenge of his broken life, admitting his failures to the daughter who'd already mourned him as effectively dead, while simultaneously asking her to risk everything for evidence that powerful people would kill to suppress. John crawled forward into the darkness, carrying the Morrison family's final hope toward whatever redemption or damnation awaited at the tunnel's end. Chapter 9, the dark moment. The tunnel collapsed. John felt the rumble first, a deep vibration that traveled through concrete and bone before his mind could process what it meant. Then the ceiling gave way behind him, tons of debris and rushing water, creating a wall where his escape route had been moments before. The city's aging infrastructure, overwhelmed by December's relentless rain and the weight of secrets buried in its depths, had finally surrendered. He was trapped. The laptop bag floated beside him in water that now reached his chest, the Morrison family's evidence bobbing like a life preserver in the rising flood. John grabbed for it desperately, his numbed fingers struggling to maintain grip on the one thing that gave his suffering meaning. The encrypted drive in his pocket felt like a lead weight, pulling him down into dark water that tasted of rust and broken promises. His phone screen flickered and died as water invaded its circuits. Emma's contact information, the number he'd memorized but never had courage to dial, vanished into electronic darkness. 4 years of imagined conversations, rehearsed apologies, and desperate hope disappeared with the device's final gasp. Even if he survived the tunnel, he had no way to reach the daughter who represented his only chance at redemption. The water continued rising. John's breathing became shallow, panicked gasps that echoed off concrete walls closing in around him. Hypothermia was advancing beyond shivers into the dangerous territory where rational thought became impossible. His accountant's mind, the analytical precision that had once made him valuable, that Morrison had counted on to decode financial conspiracies, was dissolving into primitive survival instincts. He thought about Chen's final moments upstairs, her composed acceptance of death while federal killers stormed her sanctuary. She'd died believing John would carry Morrison's truth to someone who could act on it. Instead, he was drowning in a storm drain like the broken failure his family already believed him to be. The laptop bag's strap snapped. John lunged for it in the churning water, his frozen hands closing on nothing but darkness as the Morrison family's evidence sank beyond reach. 3 years of careful hiding, Morrison's brilliant financial analysis, Chen's sacrifice, the murdered family's final hope, all of it disappearing into Portland's underground while he watched helplessly. The conspiracy would survive. Richardson's blood money would continue financing shadow wars. Hurricane victims would die waiting for relief funds that had been stolen before the storms even made landfall. Everything was lost. John's legs cramped in the cold water, muscles seizing with hypothermic spasms that made swimming impossible. He pressed his back against the tunnel wall, fighting to keep his head above the surface while numbness spread through his extremities. The encrypted drive was still in his pocket, but without the laptop's financial records to provide context, without Emma's legal expertise to properly document the evidence, the small device contained nothing but meaningless data. He was going to die here, alone, forgotten, having failed everyone who'd counted on him just as he'd failed his family years before. The gambling addiction that had destroyed his marriage would claim one final victim, not just John himself, but the murdered Morrison family whose truth would die with him in Portland's depths. The water reached his neck. John tilted his head back, gasping for air in the narrowing pocket between flood and ceiling. His mind began cataloguing regrets with the methodical precision he'd once applied to financial audits. Emma's college graduation, where his absence had left an empty chair that spoke louder than any speech. The Christmas morning when 8-year-old twins named Morrison had opened presents for the last time, never knowing their father's conscience would doom them all. Chen's trust, betrayed by his incompetence, just as he'd betrayed everyone who'd ever believed in his potential for redemption. The storm drain system groaned around him, Portland's underground infrastructure straining against forces it was never designed to contain. Water pressure was building behind the collapse, seeking new outlets through cracks and weakened joints. The city above continued its normal December rhythm, coffee shops serving lattes, Christmas shoppers fighting traffic, politicians crafting statements that meant nothing, while the evidence of their corruption sank into darkness below. John's vision began tunneling, hypothermia, and oxygen deprivation, combining to narrow his awareness to a pinpoint of desperate clarity. He was nobody important dying in nobody's concern, a homeless man whose disappearance would generate no investigation, whose death would inconvenience no one except perhaps old Pete, who might wonder why John never returned to share stories about better days. The water covered his mouth. John pressed his nose against the concrete ceiling, breathing through the final inch of air trapped in the collapsing tunnel. The encrypted drive felt heavy in his pocket, a useless talisman carrying secrets that would die with him. Morrison's financial brilliance, Chen's sacrifice, Emma's potential for legal advocacy, all meaningless now that the critical link between evidence and action was drowning in Portland's forgotten spaces. He closed his eyes and sank beneath the surface, carrying the truth about $3 billion stolen dollars into darkness where it would remain forever. Chapter 10. The Revelation. The water stopped rising. John's lungs burned as he fought against the darkness pulling him down, his body's desperate survival instincts overriding his mind's acceptance of death. Something had changed in the tunnel's acoustics. The rushing roar of incoming floodwater replaced by an ominous stillness that pressed against his eardrums like a held breath. He kicked upward through the murky water, breaking the surface into a pocket of air that shouldn't have existed. The laptop bag floated 3 feet away, its waterproof construction keeping it buoyant despite the snapped strap. John lunged for it with movements that felt like swimming through molasses, hypothermia making every gesture a monumental effort. His fingers closed around the handle just as understanding crashed over him with more force than the tunnel collapse. Morrison had planned for this. Not the specific scenario of John drowning in a storm drain, but the broader catastrophe of evidence falling into the wrong hands. The laptop bag's waterproof design wasn't accident. It was insurance against the kind of systematic persecution that had already killed Morrison's family. The man had been a forensic accountant himself, someone who understood that the most important evidence always faced the greatest danger of destruction. John pulled himself onto a concrete ledge that emerged from the receding water, his body shaking uncontrollably as he examined the bag with new understanding. Hidden compartments lined its interior, containing not just the laptop, but additional drives, printed documents sealed in plastic, and detailed instructions written in Morrison's careful handwriting. The man had anticipated betrayal from every possible direction, including the failure of any single person to successfully transmit his evidence. "If you're reading this, I'm probably dead," Morrison's letter began. "Chen told me you have a daughter in corporate law. Don't contact her directly. They'll be monitoring your family's communications. Instead, use the secondary protocols outlined below." The revelation hit John like electrical current through his hypothermic nervous system. Morrison hadn't just been paranoid, he'd been strategically brilliant. Every contingency had been considered, every failure mode anticipated and countered. The financial records John thought he'd lost were duplicated across multiple devices, each encrypted differently and hidden in separate locations throughout Portland. Storage Unit 247 had been just the beginning. Morrison's instructions detailed 4 additional cache sites scattered across the city, each containing pieces of the complete puzzle. The Morrison family's disappearance hadn't been an extraction gone wrong. It had been a desperate attempt to buy time for Morrison to finish distributing evidence that would survive any single point of failure. Chen had been one of several handlers, each managing different aspects of Morrison's insurance policy against government assassination. John's phone was dead, but the bag contained a satellite communicator that bypassed normal cellular networks. Morrison's paranoia extended to anticipating infrastructure failure, whether from natural disasters or deliberate interference. The device powered on with a soft beep that echoed strangely in the flooded tunnel. The water continued receding as pressure equalized throughout the storm drain system. John realized the collapse behind him hadn't sealed his escape route. It had redirected flow into parallel tunnels, creating a temporary air pocket that Morrison's planning had somehow anticipated. The man's understanding of Portland's underground infrastructure suggested months of careful preparation, mapping not just financial conspiracies, but physical escape routes for the evidence he was determined to preserve. Emma's contact information appeared on the satellite device's screen, along with detailed instructions for secure communication protocols that would protect her from government surveillance. Morrison had researched John's family as thoroughly as he'd investigated Richardson's financial crimes, understanding that emotional leverage would be necessary to motivate a broken father's cooperation. "Your daughter specializes in federal contract law because she wants to prevent the kind of corruption that destroyed your marriage," Morrison had written. "She doesn't know about your gambling addiction's connection to government contract fraud, but she will understand when you explain how Richardson's blood money financed the wars that created the refugee crisis. Her pro bono work addresses." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. John's gambling addiction hadn't been random weakness. It had been systematically encouraged by the same network that was now trying to kill him. The high-stakes games, the insider tips on government contracts, the loans that had seemed too generous to refuse, all of it designed to compromise forensic accountants who might stumble across evidence of systematic corruption. Richardson's conspiracy hadn't just stolen $3 billion in disaster relief funds. It had weaponized human weakness, turning professional investigators into unwitting accomplices by exploiting their personal vulnerabilities. John hadn't fallen from grace. He'd been pushed, his addiction cultivated as insurance against his analytical skills. Morrison's final revelation was the most devastating. The Morrison family is alive. Their disappearance had been staged, their deaths fabricated to provide Morrison with the cover necessary to complete his evidence gathering. The Christmas photos John had found were breadcrumbs leading investigators toward the truth, while the real family lived under protection in a location known only to Morrison himself. John stared at the satellite communicator's screen, understanding that everything had changed. He wasn't just carrying evidence of financial conspiracy, he was carrying the key to reuniting a family that had sacrificed everything to expose government corruption. The truth would either restore his purpose or complete his destruction, but for the first time in 4 years, John Hartwell knew exactly who he needed to become. John's fingers trembled as he activated the satellite communicator, its encrypted signal cutting through Portland's storm-darkened sky to reach networks that existed beyond government surveillance. Morrison's revelation had transformed everything. Not just the scope of the conspiracy, but John's understanding of his own role in events that stretched back years before he'd ever heard the Morrison name. The device's screen displayed a secure message interface, along with coordinates for the first cache site, Pioneer Courthouse Square, beneath the Christmas tree that had stood in the city's heart every December for decades. Morrison's instructions were precise. A safety deposit box key hidden inside the tree's base, accessible only during the 30 minutes each evening when security patrols rotated shifts. But first, John needed allies, real ones, not the government operatives who'd been manipulating his life since his forensic accounting days. The tunnel's water had receded enough to reveal a maintenance ladder leading to street level. John climbed slowly, his hypothermic muscles protesting every movement as he ascended from Portland's underground into the ordinary chaos of downtown traffic. Above ground, the city continued its normal rhythm, completely unaware that evidence of a $3 billion conspiracy had nearly drowned in the storm drains beneath their feet. John made his way through Pioneer Courthouse Square, studying the Christmas tree with new eyes. Morrison's paranoia had been justified. Even now, John could spot at least 3 surveillance teams positioned around the square's perimeter. They weren't watching for him specifically, but maintaining general observation on the location Morrison had chosen for his first cache. Which meant Morrison's network had included other operatives, people who'd been feeding intelligence to the conspirators while secretly working to expose them. The realization filled John with something he hadn't felt in years, hope tempered by strategic thinking rather than desperate improvisation. He needed to reach Emma, but not through conventional channels that Richardson's people would be monitoring. Morrison's instructions included protocols for secure contact, but they required access to encrypted communication equipment stored at the second cache site. Everything was connected, each piece of Morrison's plan designed to force his eventual successor through a gauntlet that would either reveal their competence or eliminate them before they could compromise the larger operation. John found the first opportunity for recruitment in an unexpected place, the loading dock behind Powell's books, where Martinez was accepting a delivery of returned textbooks. His young friend looked up in surprise as John approached, taking in his soaked clothes and the determined expression that had replaced weeks of defeated resignation. "John, what happened to you? You look like I've been swimming in storm drains," John finished. "Which I have. Martinez, I need your help with something that's going to sound completely insane," he explained quickly, watching Martinez's expression cycle through disbelief, concern, and finally a kind of excited understanding that reminded John why he'd been drawn to the young man's optimism. Martinez had grown up in East Portland, where government indifference wasn't theoretical but daily reality. The idea that federal agencies might be stealing disaster relief funds resonated with lived experience that no amount of official denials could contradict. So you're saying this Morrison guy predicted everything? Even how to contact your daughter safely? Martinez pulled out his own phone, a cheap device that would be beneath government surveillance interest. Because if we're doing this, we need to be smart about it. John felt a surge of gratitude for the pronoun change, we instead of you. He wasn't alone anymore, carrying Morrison's burden in isolation. Martinez's street knowledge complemented John's analytical skills, creating exactly the kind of partnership Morrison's instructions seemed designed to encourage. They spent an hour planning their approach to Pioneer Courthouse Square, using Martinez's familiarity with downtown security patterns to identify optimal timing for the cash retrieval. The young man's enthusiasm was infectious, his questions forcing John to think through Morrison's strategy with renewed clarity. "This isn't just about money," Martinez said as they prepared to move. "It's about proving the system actually works when people are brave enough to make it work." John nodded, understanding that Martinez had articulated something he'd been struggling to define. Morrison hadn't just gathered evidence, he'd created a test of whether ordinary people could successfully challenge institutional corruption when provided with proper tools and information. The storage unit auction, John's discovery of the evidence, even his near death in the storm drain, all of it designed to forge someone capable of completing Morrison's mission. As evening approached, and they moved toward Pioneer Courthouse Square, John felt his professional instincts reasserting themselves for the first time in years. The scattered pieces of Morrison's plan were forming a coherent picture, each cache site representing not just evidence storage, but a checkpoint that would either validate or eliminate potential allies. The Morrison family was alive, waiting somewhere for evidence that would free them from protective hiding. Richardson's conspiracy extended beyond financial theft into systematic corruption of the investigative process itself. And John Hartwell, broken, homeless, addicted, forgotten, had become the unlikely key to reuniting a family while exposing crimes that reached the highest levels of government. The Christmas tree's lights glowed against Portland's grey sky as John approached his first deliberate step back into the world that had tried to destroy him. Chapter 12, The Road Back. The Christmas tree stood 30 feet tall in Pioneer Courthouse Square's center, its lights casting red and gold shadows across wet pavement where holiday shoppers hurried past without knowing they walked over the epicenter of a federal conspiracy. John crouched behind the coffee cart at the square's northeast corner, watching security patterns with the methodical attention that had once made him Portland's most feared forensic accountant. Martinez approached from the opposite direction, his youthful appearance making him invisible to the surveillance teams positioned around the square's perimeter. They'd rehearsed this approach twice, timing their movement to coincide with the shift change that Morrison's instructions had identified as a 30-minute vulnerability in federal observation protocols. John's satellite communicator vibrated against his chest, a message from an encrypted number that shouldn't have existed. "Richardson knows you survived. 3 teams closing on downtown. Move now or abort." The warning came from someone inside Richardson's network, another piece of Morrison's carefully constructed insurance policy revealing itself at the critical moment. John felt his old analytical instincts sharpening, the same predatory focus that had once tracked financial irregularities through thousands of government contracts, now applied to reading human patterns in real-time surveillance. He signaled Martinez, who nodded and began his casual approach toward the Christmas tree's base. The young man moved with studied nonchalance, just another Portland resident cutting through the square on his way home from work. But John could see the tension in his shoulders, the heightened awareness that came from understanding the stakes they were playing for. The safety deposit box key was exactly where Morrison's instructions had indicated, taped inside a hollow space behind the tree's electrical access panel, hidden among thick cables that powered the holiday display. Martinez retrieved it smoothly, his movements masked by the cover story of tying his shoe near the tree's base. Something was wrong. The surveillance teams had shifted position, their casual dispersal around the square tightening into a pattern John recognized from his government contract days. Richardson's people weren't just watching anymore, they were preparing to move. John activated the satellite communicator's emergency protocol, sending a predetermined signal that would alert Morrison's remaining network to immediate danger. The response came back within seconds: cache site compromised, secondary extraction point active, Burnside Bridge, east approach, 10 minutes. The chase began as John and Martinez separated, each taking different routes away from Pioneer Courthouse Square as federal agents converged on the Christmas tree. John heard the sharp crack of radios activating, saw the purposeful movement of men in dark coats who no longer bothered maintaining their civilian cover. He ran through Portland's downtown core with desperate efficiency, his homeless man's knowledge of the city's hidden spaces suddenly transformed into tactical advantage. 4 years of surviving on the streets had taught him routes that didn't appear on any federal surveillance map: service alleys, basement connections between buildings, maintenance tunnels that connected the underground infrastructure he'd nearly died in hours earlier. Behind him, he could hear the systematic coordination of a federal manhunt. Richardson's resources were vast, his reach extending into agencies that should have been investigating, instead of protecting his crimes. But Morrison had anticipated this too, his instructions including protocols for exactly this scenario. John reached Burnside Bridge's eastern approach to find Martinez already waiting, the young man's face flushed with excitement and terror in equal measure. Between them, they carried the key to Morrison's second cache and the beginning of evidence that could topple a conspiracy extending to the highest levels of government. "This is really happening," Martinez said, his voice carrying wonder that cut through John's tactical focus. "We're really going to expose them." John nodded, but his mind was already calculating the costs their commitment would demand. Richardson's people had revealed themselves tonight, abandoning subtlety for direct action that meant they considered John an existential threat. There would be no return to his invisible life on Portland's streets, no quiet anonymity among the forgotten and overlooked. He thought about Emma, probably working late in her corporate law office, unaware that her father was about to drag her into a federal conspiracy that could destroy her career or worse. Morrison's protocols would protect her, but only if John succeeded in exposing Richardson's crimes before the man's resources could eliminate everyone who threatened him. The satellite communicator displayed coordinates for the second cache site, along with a new message that made John's blood freeze: Morrison family's location compromised, extraction failing, evidence your only chance to save them. Everything crystallized with devastating clarity. Morrison hadn't just planned for evidence preservation, he'd known that his eventual successor would face exactly this choice between safety and redemption. The Morrison family's lives now depended on John's willingness to complete a mission that would almost certainly cost him his own. As federal searchlights began sweeping the Burnside Bridge approach, John understood that he'd crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. Morrison's road back to purpose led through dangers that would either restore his soul or destroy him completely. The final confrontation was no longer approaching. It had already begun. Chapter 13, the final test. The searchlights swept across Burnside Bridge's eastern approach in systematic patterns, their harsh white beams cutting through Portland's winter darkness like the blades of a closing trap. John pressed himself against the bridge's concrete support structure, feeling the vibration of heavy vehicles positioning themselves on both sides of the Willamette River. Richardson had deployed resources that went far beyond normal federal surveillance. This was a military-style operation designed to eliminate threats rather than arrest suspects. Martinez crouched beside him, the young man's earlier excitement replaced by the sober realization that they were no longer playing at conspiracy theories. The satellite communicator in John's hands displayed real-time updates from Morrison's network, each message confirming that the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. Morrison family location breached. Protective detail compromised. You have maybe 6 hours before Richardson's cleanup crew reaches them. John's forensic accountant mind processed the timeline with devastating clarity. 6 hours to retrieve evidence from Morrison's second cache, establish secure contact with Emma, and expose a $3 billion conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, against resources that included federal agencies, military contractors, and apparently unlimited operational funding. The odds were mathematically impossible, which meant Morrison had planned for exactly these circumstances. The second cache, John whispered to Martinez. Morrison knew this would happen. He wouldn't put the family's location in my hands unless he was certain I could reach the evidence in time. The coordinates on the satellite communicator led to Portland's industrial district, specifically to a decommissioned grain elevator that had stood empty since the economic collapse of 2008. John knew the building. His forensic accounting work had once investigated the suspicious circumstances surrounding its federal loan default, a case that had been mysteriously closed before he could complete his analysis. Now he understood why. Richardson's conspiracy hadn't just stolen disaster relief funds, it had systematically acquired strategic infrastructure through engineered bankruptcies, creating a network of safe houses and evidence storage sites hidden in plain sight throughout the Pacific Northwest. Morrison had been working from inside that network, using Richardson's own resources against him. "We need to split up," John told Martinez. "They're tracking us as a pair, but if you can reach the grain elevator first—" "No." Martinez's voice carried surprising authority. "You taught me that the most important thing in any investigation is protecting the evidence chain. If we separate now, Richardson's people can eliminate one of us and claim the whole operation was fabricated." The young man was right, and his tactical thinking reminded John why Morrison's plan had included provisions for recruiting allies. This wasn't a mission for lone heroes. It was a test of whether ordinary people could coordinate effectively against institutional corruption when provided with proper tools and motivation. John activated the satellite communicator's emergency broadcast function, sending their location and status to every contact in Morrison's network. If they were going to die tonight, at least the evidence of their investigation would survive to guide whoever came next. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across Portland, Morrison's network activated simultaneously. Former government employees who'd been quietly documenting Richardson's crimes, journalists who'd been building cases they couldn't publish, even homeless advocates who'd noticed the systematic redirection of federal housing funds into private accounts. Morrison hadn't just recruited a successor, he'd built an entire shadow organization dedicated to exposing the conspiracy that had killed his family. John felt something he hadn't experienced in 4 years, the weight of competent people depending on his expertise. Martinez was right. They had to stay together, combining John's analytical skills with the young man's street knowledge and the network, coordinated support, to create something greater than the sum of its parts. They moved toward the industrial district through routes that Morrison's network cleared in real time, each message on the satellite communicator representing another person willing to risk everything to ensure that Richardson's crimes couldn't remain hidden. John understood that this was Morrison's true final test. Not just whether John could retrieve evidence, but whether he could trust others enough to accept help after years of isolated self-destruction. The grain elevator loomed against Portland's skyline like a concrete monument to systematic failure, its empty windows reflecting the searchlights that continued sweeping the river behind them. Inside that building waited evidence that could save the Morrison family and expose crimes that had corrupted the entire federal disaster response system. But first, John had to prove he'd learned the most important lesson Morrison had tried to teach him, that redemption wasn't a solitary journey, but a collaborative act of trust between broken people who chose to rebuild something better than what they'd lost. As federal helicopters began circling the industrial district, John Hartwell prepared to discover whether 4 years of homelessness had destroyed his ability to lead, or forged him into exactly the weapon Morrison's justice required. The final test had begun, and failure would cost more than just his own life. Chapter 14, The Confrontation. The grain elevator's loading dock exploded inward as Richardson's tactical team breached the entrance with military precision. John threw himself behind a concrete pillar as automatic weapons fire shredded the air where he'd been standing seconds earlier, the muzzle flashes strobing across decades of industrial decay like lightning illuminating a graveyard. "Hartwell!" Richardson's voice echoed through the cavernous space, amplified by tactical speakers that made him sound like the voice of institutional judgment itself. "You're protecting evidence of crimes that never happened, defending a family that's already dead." John pressed his back against the pillar, feeling the vibration of boots on metal stairs as Richardson's team moved to surround his position. The satellite communicator in his pocket displayed Morrison's final cache coordinates, 50 feet above them, hidden in the grain elevator's control room where Morrison had spent months documenting every financial transaction that had funded Richardson's conspiracy. Martinez was somewhere in the darkness to John's left, the young man's position masked by the industrial machinery that filled the elevator's lower level. They'd separated upon entry, John drawing the tactical team's attention while Martinez climbed toward the evidence that could expose $3 billion in stolen federal disaster funds. "You want to know why Morrison's family really disappeared?" Richardson's voice carried the confidence of a man who'd eliminated threats for decades. "Because James Morrison was stealing from disaster victims, and when we discovered his embezzlement, he murdered his wife and daughters to prevent their testimony." The accusation hit John like a physical blow, its calculated cruelty designed to shatter his faith in Morrison's mission. But John's forensic accountant training had taught him to recognize projection when he heard it. Richardson was describing his own crimes, inverting the narrative to justify the systematic elimination of witnesses. John activated the satellite communicator's broadcast function, ensuring that Richardson's words were being recorded and transmitted to Morrison's network in real time. If tonight ended with John's death, at least Richardson would be exposed, condemning himself through his own lies. "The Morrison family is alive," John called back, his voice carrying across the grain elevator with surprising strength. "Hidden in protective custody while you've spent 3 years hunting them. But tonight that ends." He heard Richardson's sharp intake of breath, the first crack in the man's professional composure. The federal agent hadn't known that John had discovered the family's survival, and that revelation changed everything about the tactical situation. "Martinez now!" John shouted. The young man appeared in the control room's windows 50 feet above, Morrison's evidence files clutched in his hands as he activated a dead man's switch that Morrison had built into the grain elevator's electrical system. Suddenly, every light in the building blazed to life, the brilliant illumination transforming the space from a tactical advantage for Richardson's team into a spotlight exposing their federal badges and military equipment to news helicopters that had been circling outside. Richardson's operation was designed for darkness and deniability. Under full illumination, with evidence of Morrison's conspiracy being broadcast live to news networks, the federal agent found himself trapped by the same institutional protocols he'd spent years manipulating. John stepped out from behind his pillar, his hands raised, but his expression carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to read power structures from the inside. Around him, Richardson's tactical team hesitated, their weapons trained on a target who was no longer running. "Agent Richardson," John said, his voice carrying the authority he'd once wielded as Portland's most feared forensic accountant. "You're under citizen's arrest for conspiracy, murder, and theft of federal disaster relief funds. The evidence is already in the hands of the Attorney General's office." Richardson emerged from behind his own cover, his face twisted with the rage of a predator who'd discovered that his prey had become the hunter. "You think you've won something here? You're a homeless drunk who gambled away his own family. No one will believe your testimony against a 30-year federal agent." "They won't have to believe me," John replied. "They'll believe Morrison's evidence. 3 years of financial records, recorded conversations, and witness testimony from disaster victims across the Pacific Northwest. Everything you've stolen, everyone you've killed, documented in the kind of detail that made James Morrison the best forensic accountant the federal government ever employed. Richardson's hand moved toward his service weapon, but John had already anticipated the motion. 4 years on Portland's streets had taught him to read violence before it erupted, and his voice cut through the tension with devastating precision. The Morrison family is watching this broadcast from protective custody. Your tactical team is being recorded by news helicopters, and in 30 minutes, federal marshals who aren't part of your network will arrive to place you under arrest. John's smile carried no warmth, only the satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved. Morrison planned for everything, including your final desperation. In the grain elevator's harsh lighting, John Hartwell faced the man who destroyed the Morrison family and realized that his 4 years of homeless exile had ended exactly where Morrison always intended, with a broken man choosing redemption over safety and discovering that sometimes the forgotten possess exactly the weapons that justice requires. Chapter 15, The Sacrifice. Richardson's weapon cleared its holster in a smooth motion perfected by 30 years of federal service, the barrel sweeping toward John with the inevitability of institutional power asserting itself against individual defiance. In that crystalline moment, John understood that Morrison's plan had always included this exact scenario, not just the exposure of corruption, but the cost that exposure would demand. "You think you've solved something," Richardson snarled, his professional mask finally stripped away to reveal the desperate predator beneath. "You think Morrison's evidence matters when everyone who's seen it dies tonight?" Above them, Martinez froze in the control room, Morrison's files scattered across the floor like judgment documents awaiting final verdict. The young man's face showed the terrible comprehension that victory and death might arrive in the same instant, that justice sometimes required martyrs to purchase its implementation. John felt the familiar weight of calculation settling over his mind, his forensic accountant training automatically processing probabilities and outcomes with devastating clarity. Richardson's weapon was trained on him, but the federal agent's tactical team was hesitating, their cameras and witnesses making them reluctant to execute an unarmed man on live television. The satellite communicator in John's pocket displayed a final message from Morrison's network, federal marshals 12 minutes out. Evidence package confirmed received by Attorney General. Family extraction successful. 12 minutes. The Morrison family was safe, the evidence was delivered, and justice would arrive in exactly 12 minutes. All that remained was keeping Richardson from destroying the witnesses who could testify to what they'd discovered. "You're right about one thing," John said, his voice carrying a strange peace that cut through the tension like absolution itself. "I am a homeless drunk who destroyed his own family. I gambled away everything that mattered, chose addiction over love, and spent 4 years convincing myself that redemption was impossible." He took a step toward Richardson, the movement causing the federal agent's finger to tighten on his trigger. "But Morrison taught me something I'd forgotten. Sometimes broken people are exactly what justice requires, because we have nothing left to lose except the chance to mean something." Richardson's eyes narrowed with predatory focus. "You think dying for strangers makes you a hero? You think this changes what you are?" "No," John replied. "It changes what I choose to become." The realization hit him with overwhelming clarity. Morrison hadn't just recruited him to expose Richardson's crimes, he'd orchestrated John's entire journey from the storage unit auction to this moment, knowing that a man who'd lost everything would be willing to sacrifice everything to prevent others from suffering the same fate. The $2.3 million in Morrison's safe hadn't been evidence of conspiracy. It had been blood money, Richardson's payments for Morrison's silence, funds that Morrison had kept as proof of corruption while planning his family's escape. Morrison had let John discover the money knowing that a gambling addict would be tempted to steal it, and that resisting that temptation would prove John was ready for redemption. Every step of the investigation had been a test, not just of John's analytical skills, but of his willingness to choose justice over self-preservation, to trust others after years of isolation, to believe that his broken life could still serve a purpose greater than his own survival. "Martinez," John called, without taking his eyes off Richardson. "The emergency broadcast function on the communicator. Activate it now." The young man's hands moved across Morrison's equipment, and suddenly every screen in the grain elevator blazed with live feeds from news networks across the Pacific Northwest. Richardson's face appeared on a dozen monitors, his weapon clearly visible, his crimes being documented in real time by cameras that would preserve every word for federal prosecutors. 30 years, Richardson whispered, his voice carrying the hollow sound of a man watching his entire life collapse. 30 years of service, and you think they'll believe a drunk and a college dropout over a federal agent? "They don't have to believe us," John said, gesturing toward the monitors displaying Morrison's evidence files. $3 billion in stolen disaster relief funds. 47 documented murders disguised as accidents. Financial records that trace every payment from disaster victims' accounts into your personal offshore holdings. Richardson's weapon wavered, his tactical training warring with the desperate realization that killing witnesses wouldn't stop evidence that had already reached federal prosecutors. Around him, his own tactical team was stepping back, their institutional loyalty fracturing as they understood they were no longer conducting an authorized operation. John felt the weight of Emma's future settling on his shoulders, the knowledge that his daughter's life would be forever changed by what happened in the next 12 minutes. Richardson's network included people who could destroy her career, eliminate her opportunities, punish her for her father's choice to seek redemption. But Morrison had planned for that too. The evidence package included financial records proving Richardson's people had manipulated John's gambling addiction, engineered his family's destruction, used him as an unwitting asset for years before discarding him to homelessness. Emma would learn the truth about her father's fall, but she would also discover that his rise from the streets represented a choice to sacrifice everything for strangers who deserved justice. John smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in 4 years. Morrison was right about broken people, Richardson. We really don't have anything left to lose. In the grain elevator's blazing lights, John Hartwell faced his final choice between safety and meaning, and discovered that redemption's price was exactly what he was willing to pay. Chapter 16, The Resolution. Richardson's weapon clattered to the concrete floor as federal marshals flooded through the grain elevator's entrances, their synchronized entry choreographed with military precision. The corrupt agent's shoulders sagged in defeat as zip-tie restraints secured his wrists, his 3 decades of institutional power evaporating under the harsh industrial lighting that had transformed his tactical advantage into a spotlight exposing his crimes. John remained motionless against the concrete pillar, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion as the immediate threat dissolved around him. Above them, Martinez slowly descended from the control room, Morrison's evidence files clutched against his chest like sacred texts that had finally found their proper congregation. "John Hartwell?" The lead marshal approached with cautious respect, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd read classified briefings about the homeless man who'd unraveled a federal conspiracy. "I'm Marshal Catherine Wells. The Attorney General sends his personal thanks for your service to the American people." The words felt surreal after 4 years of invisibility on Portland's streets. Service. As if his journey from gambling addiction to homelessness to this moment had been some form of patriotic duty rather than a desperate attempt to find meaning in the wreckage of his life. John watched Richardson being led away in restraints. The federal agent's face twisted with impotent rage as news cameras captured every step of his perp walk. 30 years of institutional corruption ending in handcuffs and headlines, the very system Richardson had manipulated, now turning its full weight against him with methodical precision. "The Morrison family," John managed, his voice hoarse from shouting over gunfire. "Are they?" "Safe," Marshal Wells confirmed. They're being relocated to permanent protective custody, new identities, full federal protection. James Morrison sends his gratitude for completing his mission. The satellite communicator buzzed with an encrypted message that made John's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Morrison's words appeared on the small screen with devastating simplicity. "Thank you for proving that redemption is possible. My daughters will grow up knowing that broken people can choose to become heroes." Martinez reached the ground level, his young face bearing the shell-shocked expression of someone who'd witnessed justice arrive with live ammunition. "Is it over? Really over?" John looked around the grain elevator, taking in the federal agents documenting evidence, the news crews broadcasting Richardson's arrest, the tactical equipment abandoned by a corrupt team that had discovered the difference between institutional loyalty and criminal conspiracy. The immediate danger was finished, but the aftermath would ripple through federal agencies for years. For Richardson, yes, John said, but there were others in his network. Senators, agency directors, defense contractors who profited from stolen disaster relief funds. Morrison's evidence will expose them all, but it'll take time. Time that John might not have to see. 4 years of homeless living had taken a toll that victory couldn't erase. Malnutrition, untreated medical conditions, the psychological damage of social invisibility. He'd sacrificed everything to complete Morrison's mission, and that everything had included his own health and future. Marshall Wells produced a thick envelope sealed with federal classifications. "The Attorney General authorized me to deliver this personally. Your consulting fee for services rendered to the United States government." John's hands shook as he opened the envelope, revealing a check that made his forensic accountant mind automatically calculate possibilities. $200,000, enough to rebuild his life, find housing, receive medical treatment, perhaps even attempt reconciliation with Emma if she could forgive 4 years of abandonment. "There's also this," Wells continued, producing a letter bearing his daughter's handwriting. "She wanted me to tell you that she's been following the news coverage. She's proud of what you've accomplished." The letter remained unread in John's trembling hands as tears he'd suppressed for years finally broke through his emotional defenses. Emma had written to him. His daughter, the brilliant attorney who'd built a career while her father lived under bridges, had reached out across 4 years of silence to acknowledge that his broken journey had led somewhere meaningful. Martinez moved closer, the young man's presence solid and reassuring. "What happens now? To us, I mean?" John looked at his unlikely partner, the college dropout who'd risked everything to help expose Richardson's crimes. "Morrison's network still needs coordination. Federal prosecutors will require testimony from dozens of witnesses. And there are other storage units out there, other forgotten evidence waiting for people who know how to find it." The implication hung between them like an invitation. John's expertise in forensic accounting, Martinez's street knowledge, Morrison's carefully built network of allies. Together they could continue the work of exposing corruption that federal agencies couldn't or wouldn't investigate themselves. "A partnership?" Martinez asked, understanding the unspoken proposal. John smiled, feeling purpose settling into his bones like medicine after years of spiritual illness. Morrison was right about broken people. Sometimes we're exactly what justice requires. Outside the grain elevator, Portland's dawn was breaking over a city where homeless camps still lined the riverfront and disaster relief funds had been systematically stolen for 3 years. But for the first time since losing everything to gambling addiction, John Hartwell faced the sunrise, knowing that broken things could be repaired, that redemption was possible, and that sometimes the forgotten possessed exactly the weapons that justice required. The immediate battle was won, but the war for accountability had just begun. Chapter 17, The Return. 2 months after Richardson's arrest, John stood outside Emma's law office in downtown Portland, his reflection in the polished glass doors showing a man transformed. The federal consulting fee had purchased more than housing and medical care. It had restored the dignity that 4 years of homelessness had stripped away. Clean-shaven, wearing a modest suit that fit properly, he looked like the forensic accountant he'd once been. but his eyes carried depths that success had never taught him. The letter from Emma remained creased in his wallet, read so many times the paper had grown soft as fabric. "Dad, I saw the news coverage. I understand now what really happened to our family, why you fell so far. Richardson's people destroyed you deliberately, and you chose to destroy them in return. I'd like to hear your story, if you're ready to tell it." Through the glass, he could see her at her desk, bent over legal documents, with the focused intensity he remembered from her childhood homework sessions. She'd grown into the brilliant woman he'd always known she would become, building her career while he'd crawled through addiction and homelessness toward this unlikely redemption. The receptionist announced his arrival with professional courtesy, and Emma's head lifted, her expression cycling through surprise, uncertainty, and something that might have been hope. 4 years collapsed into silence as father and daughter faced each other across the distance that shame and abandonment had created. "You look," Emma began, then stopped, her attorney's precision failing her for perhaps the first time in years. "Human again," John finished. "I know it's been a long time. Too long." She gestured toward the chair across from her desk, the same careful formality she might offer any client, but her hands trembled slightly as she closed the legal files. "I read the federal reports about Morrison's investigation, about what Richardson's network did to our family." John settled into the chair, noting how Emma's office reflected the success he'd once demanded she achieve. Law degree prominently displayed, case awards, professional recognition, all the markers of accomplishment that had mattered to him before he learned the difference between achievement and meaning. "They used my gambling addiction as a weapon," he said quietly, "manipulated my access to forensic data, fed me insider information that made my bets seem brilliant, then cut me off when I was too deep to climb out. They needed me discredited, my testimony worthless, before Morrison's investigation could expose their conspiracy." Emma's professional composure cracked slightly. "You're saying your gambling problem was deliberately engineered?" "The addiction was real," John clarified. "The vulnerability was mine. But Richardson's people amplified it, weaponized it, turned my weakness into their tool for destroying my credibility." He pulled Morrison's evidence summary from his briefcase, pages of financial records that documented the psychological manipulation with devastating precision. "I made the choice to gamble. They made sure I couldn't stop losing." For long minutes, Emma studied the documents, her attorney's mind processing evidence that reframed 4 years of abandonment and shame. When she finally looked up, tears had replaced the professional distance in her eyes. "I blamed you," she whispered, "for choosing gambling over family, for walking away from everything that mattered. I never imagined—" "You were right to blame me," John interrupted. "I did choose gambling. I did abandon you and your mother. Learning that Richardson orchestrated my fall doesn't excuse the choices I made afterward." Emma leaned back in her chair, studying her father with the careful attention she'd once given to complex legal briefs. "But it explains why redemption mattered enough for you to risk everything. You weren't just exposing Richardson's crimes, you were proving that broken people could fight back." The conversation shifted as John described his partnership with Martinez, their growing network of allies among federal investigators and homeless advocates. Morrison's evidence had triggered congressional investigations into disaster relief corruption, but the work required ongoing coordination between prosecutors and witnesses scattered across the Pacific Northwest. "We're calling it the Morrison Foundation," John explained. "Consulting services for federal agencies who need investigators without institutional blindness. People like me and Martinez, who understand how corruption looks from the bottom up." Emma's smile carried pride that John hadn't seen since her law school graduation. "Dad, that's remarkable. You've built something meaningful from everything you lost." "Not built," John corrected. "Rebuilt. Morrison showed me that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing what the past teaches you to become." They talked through the afternoon, bridging 4 years of separation with careful honesty about guilt, abandonment, and the possibility of forgiveness. Emma described her mother's remarriage to a kind man who'd helped heal the wounds of John's departure. John shared stories of Martinez's street wisdom and the unlikely community of allies that Morrison's mission had revealed. As Portland's evening light filtered through her office windows, Emma reached across her desk to touch her father's hand, the first physical contact between them since the night he'd lost their house to gambling debts. "There's something you should know," she said. "I've been consulting with federal prosecutors about Richardson's network, pro bono work, helping them understand the legal implications of the evidence you discovered." John felt completeness settling into his chest like medicine after years of spiritual illness. His daughter hadn't just forgiven his failures, she'd chosen to continue the work that had restored his purpose. "Morrison was right about broken people," John said, squeezing Emma's hand. "Sometimes we're exactly what justice requires." Outside Emma's office, Portland streets bustled with evening commuters returning to families and homes that John was slowly learning to believe he might deserve again. The homeless camps still lined the riverfront, but now John walked among them not as another invisible casualty, but as someone who understood that redemption was always possible for those willing to choose meaning over safety. Chapter 18, The New Beginning. 6 months later, John stood before a congressional subcommittee in Washington, D.C., his testimony broadcast live across networks that had once ignored homeless voices entirely. The Morrison Foundation had become something neither he nor Martinez had imagined, a bridge between forgotten people and federal justice, proving that society's most invisible citizens often possessed the clearest vision of institutional corruption. Senator Richardson's network operated for 3 decades because they understood that homeless people don't make credible witnesses, John told the assembled lawmakers, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd climbed from absolute bottom to this marble chamber. "They were wrong. We make the most credible witnesses precisely because we have nothing left to lose except the truth." The hearing room buzzed with whispered conversations as John described the Morrison Foundation's expanding work. 17 active investigations, 43 federal witnesses relocated from homeless camps to secure housing, over $8 billion in stolen disaster relief funds recovered and returned to victims. What had begun as one man's desperate search for meaning had evolved into a new model for federal accountability. Martinez sat in the gallery's front row, his confident bearing transformed by 2 years of partnership with federal prosecutors. Beside him, Emma took careful notes, her dual role as John's daughter and the Foundation's legal counsel bridging personal redemption with institutional reform. The family that gambling addiction had destroyed was rebuilding itself around the work that homelessness had revealed. After the hearing, John walked the Capitol steps with Emma and Martinez, Washington's crisp autumn air carrying possibilities he'd never imagined during those first nights sleeping rough in Portland. His phone buzzed with messages from prosecutors, journalists, and homeless advocates who understood that the Morrison Foundation represented something unprecedented, proof that society's most discarded people could become its most effective instruments of justice. "Morrison would be proud," Martinez said, scrolling through news coverage that described their testimony as groundbreaking and a new paradigm for federal accountability. He always said, "Broken people see clearly because we don't have illusions to protect." Emma smiled, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal healing. "Dad, the Justice Department wants to discuss expanding the Foundation's work nationally. Homeless populations in every major city, all potential witnesses to corruption that traditional investigators miss." John paused on the Capitol steps, looking back at the building where he'd just testified before senators who would have crossed streets to avoid him 2 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. The gambling addiction that Richardson's network had weaponized to destroy his credibility had ultimately led him to a platform where his voice carried more weight than when he'd been a respected forensic accountant. "We'll need to be careful about expansion," he said thoughtfully. "The Foundation works because it stays connected to the streets. The moment we become another bureaucracy, we lose what makes us effective." They walked toward Union Station, where John would catch the train back to Portland. He'd kept his modest apartment near the riverfront homeless camps, understanding that proximity to society's margins wasn't something to escape, but something to honor. The Morrison Foundation operated from a converted warehouse in southeast Portland, its proximity to homeless services a daily reminder that credibility came from connection, not distance. On the train platform, Emma hugged her father with the easy affection that 2 years of reconciliation had restored. "See you next month for the Richardson sentencing?" John nodded, though he felt no satisfaction about watching the corrupt federal agent receive his 40-year sentence. Richardson had been a symptom of systemic problems that the Morrison Foundation was still working to expose. True victory wouldn't come from individual prosecutions, but from institutional changes that prevented disasters like Morrison's family from needing witness protection in the first place. The train's familiar rhythm carried John westward across the American landscape that had taught him the difference between success and meaning. Through his reflection in the darkened window, he watched small towns and farmlands scroll past, each community potentially harboring the kind of corruption that ordinary citizens couldn't fight, but forgotten people might be positioned to expose. His phone displayed a text from Morrison, sent through encrypted channels from his family's permanent protection program. "Foundation's work is reaching people we never imagined. My daughters understand now that broken things can be repaired, that redemption is always possible for those willing to sacrifice safety for meaning." As Portland's lights appeared through the darkness, John thought about the storage unit auction that had changed everything. $50 for a cramped space filled with Christmas decorations and classified secrets. He'd been seeking shelter money and had discovered instead that purpose was the only currency that mattered, that redemption required not erasing the past, but transforming it into something larger than personal salvation. The Morrison Foundation would continue its work long after John's own story ended. Martinez was training new investigators, Emma was building legal frameworks for homeless witness protection, and federal agencies were slowly learning that justice sometimes required listening to voices they'd spent decades training themselves to ignore. Outside Portland's Union Station, John breathed the familiar Pacific Northwest air that had once carried only desperation and now carried hope. Tomorrow he would return to the warehouse office, coordinate with prosecutors, and continue the work of proving that broken people could become instruments of justice. Morrison had been right about broken people. Sometimes society's most discarded citizens possessed exactly the weapons that democracy required to defend itself. John Hartwell walked into Portland's night, no longer invisible, carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who discovered that redemption was not only possible but essential for individuals, institutions, and the American promise that justice was always within reach of those willing to sacrifice everything to claim it.